Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar. This afternoon, we will be covering some Azure top tips, and going through the content for you will be Brandon Pearce. He is our Azure Solutions Specialist here at Bytes. Before passing over to him, I'm just going to quickly run through some housekeeping to let you know you will be muted at all times, but if you do have any questions, you can submit these via the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll read these out at the end to be answered. If you think of anything post-webinar, you can always email tellmemore@bytes.co.uk, and we will be more than happy to pass on to your Bytes account manager or get back to you as soon as we can. Just to let you know that the webinar session will be recorded and made available to you, and we will send this out in the next day or so. And there will be a survey at the end of the webinar where you can give us your feedback on what you thought about today's session. So I'm now going to hand you over to Brandon, and he will get into the exciting stuff for you.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you very much. Great. Give me 1 second.
Thanks.
Excellent. Just let me know if you can see my screen correctly.
Yep, all good.
Excellent. Okay, great. So thank you for joining us today, this afternoon. It's quite chilly on this here in London. Hopefully it's not as chilly around where you are. So today we're going to be going through a few things that are titling as our top tips within Azure, where you're looking to adopt Azure for various services, be that for as an MSP, an ISV, whatever the case may be. As part of this call, we're going to be going through a few things today. The first thing is just a talk about some cloud adoption strategies. This is where we talk about replatforming, re-architecting to make best use of cloud services. I'll then go into cost optimizations. This is where I'll talk about things like right-sizing reservations, the Azure Pricing Calculator. I'll then briefly give an overview of the cloud adoption framework and the well-architected framework that Microsoft provides. I'm then going to mention and highlight a few services and features in Azure which we often find are overlooked, especially within the indirect market, and a couple new features that are currently in preview, which I think will be of a lot of benefit to many customers. And then lastly, we'll have an Azure incentive, which will be discussed by Imran, where partners can earn a $1,000 incentive by utilizing Azure. Okay, so let's start. So cloud adoption. This is stuff, if you've heard one of my previous talks before, it does rehash a little bit of that. I'm going to just go through quickly some underlying stuff such as infrastructure as service, software as a service, and the platform as a service, then talk about replatforming stuff and what you should be considering when you're moving forward in those directions. So infrastructure as a service is the closest to managing physical service. A cloud provider will provide and keep that hardware up to date, but the operating system maintenance and network configuration and all the rest of that stuff is up to you, the customer of Azure. For example, if you have an Azure virtual machine, Microsoft will make sure that that underlying infrastructure is working and correctly, and you'll be responsible for managing and maintaining that operating system that sits on top of that virtual machine. The advantage of this model is that it allows for that rapid deployment of new compute devices, especially in a model which is very similar to how you've done things on-prem, and that's considerably faster than procuring and installing and configuring a physical server. The benefits of this model is that you have obviously no upfront costs, so no capex. You have the agility of working with workloads that can be made accessible to users quickly, deprovisioned whenever needed. In terms of skill sets, it's no real deep technical skills required to deploy. It's very similar to deploying a virtual machine on-prem, and obviously if it's a Windows virtual machine or a Linux virtual machine, for example, then the skill sets required to manage those instances in Azure are going to be pretty much the same as if it was an on-prem solution. In terms of flexibility, IaaS is the most flexible cloud service because you have that full control over that virtual machine, but you have to also then manage and maintain that solution. In terms of platform as a service, that is a hosting environment provided by the cloud service provider. This is where that cloud provider, in this case Azure, is going to provide that infrastructure, the virtual machines, the networking resources, everything that sits underneath that platform, that service, as a managed environment. So for example, something like Azure App Service provides a managed hosting environment where developers can upload a web application without having to worry about the physical hardware or the virtual machines, any of that part of the stack, IaaS, everything of that nature. That's all taken care of as part of the platform as a service, and you just have to worry about the service that sits on top of that. Obviously, again, in terms of advantages, you have that no upfront costs. You have that agility. Well, you have more agility than IaaS because you don't have to configure service. If you've ever had the experience of running something like, say, a SQL cluster, it's can require quite a bit of technical knowledge to do so. In terms of skills, obviously, there's no deep technical skills required for that, but some training and knowledge of the PaaS offerings may be required. In terms of productivity, users can then obviously, consumers of those workloads can focus on the consumption of those workloads and the use of those workloads rather than having to worry about the underlying platform. Obviously, the limitation of this is that some services may not offer all the features and functionality that you might find from an on-prem solution or an IaaS-based solution. You're getting usually most of it, but maybe not all. And if you have some niche requirements, you will need to evaluate whether that PaaS platform is best suited for that workload or not. And then in terms of software as a service, this is probably something you're very familiar with if you're familiar with Office 365, something Dynamics, Okta, any of that sort of stuff, third-party applications that you may be purchasing for your customers. This is a service model where the cloud provider manages basically everything for you, and all you need to do is provide the data for that solution, the use of that service. So if you take, for example, M365, that provides a fully working version of Exchange Online in the cloud, and all you need to do is create your content in that, emails and stuff like that, to create your users, set that all up, utilize that service. You don't have to worry about any of the other stuff that sits underneath that. Again, you don't have those upfront costs, so unlike on-prem, you still have no CapEx model there. And it provides users with that, the latest and greatest version of that software at all times. The pricing model also with SaaS tends to be a per user base rather than a consumption of the services underneath. So, and that's usually on a monthly or yearly basis. In terms of skill sets, again, no deep technical skills are required to deploy and gain the benefits of the SaaS solution. You just need to know how to utilize that solution. In terms of flexibility, obviously users can access the same applications from anywhere based on their utilizations. The disadvantage of software as a service, obviously, is that there can be some limitations to the software application that might affect how users work. Because of that, as is software that you're purchasing, you don't have the direct control of those features. So when evaluating SaaS, very much like SaaS PaaS, you need to identify and understand if that SaaS solution, that SaaS platform is best suited for the workload that you're trying to run in the cloud, and consider any business needs and software limitations and determine how you'll handle those. So with these three solutions, you have what's known as the shared responsibility model. And within that, you can see from this diagram that with infrastructure as a service, the light blue stuff, the stuff that you would manage either for yourself or for your customers, is considerably greater than what you would be doing with a platform as a service and software as a service. Obviously, that's still less than you would with traditional on-prem, but what you'll notice is as you move from left to right, especially from infrastructure into PaaS into software as a service, what we do find is that by moving across, not only do you remove that additional requirement for you to manage the runtime, the operating system, virtual machine aspect from that into that solution, you're now also potentially getting cost benefits. So potentially just by comparing the IaaS solution compared to a PaaS solution, the PaaS solution can be cheaper. And if not, then what you will find is that you are probably reducing the amount of effort that is required in order to run that solution. And platform as a service does tend to have additional offerings that, if you're comparing just against a virtual machine, the PaaS solution tends to have more than just the same as just one virtual machine, obviously depending on the platform as a service. So the journey to the cloud that we find when users are looking to migrate customers or themselves to the cloud is oftentimes they start with a rehosting. So that lift and shift, I have a whole bunch of virtual machines. I'm considering those virtual machines as the same in the cloud. And whilst that is definitely not wrong, what we do find is that it's better to start considering the refactoring and the re-architecting of solutions. So by migrating to the cloud from an on-prem solution, as an example, there's going to be some stuff which is just naturally not going to move across. So it's automatically reducing the amount of stuff that you're going to have to run in the cloud. But once you start looking at refactoring and re-architecting, you start reducing the number of virtual machines and improving the agility potentially and the flexibility of those systems that you have running in the cloud. And this is where a lot of times we find that some apprehension comes in towards utilizing cloud services, such as it costs too much to run things in the cloud. And yes, I would definitely agree. If you're going to take everything that you have running on-prem and you just rehost it in the cloud, potentially the cost of that is going to be substantially more than if you were to start refactoring, re-architecting, and ideally, if there's an opportunity to rebuild that solution as cloud native. And when we talk about cloud native, we are talking about more modern technology. So moving away fully from virtual machines, at least virtual machines that you manage. So considering things like Kubernetes, considering mesh architectures, service buses, and these modern technologies to create distributed applications. Oftentimes for customers, if you're moving them from on-prem to the cloud, it might just be a case that cloud native is not going to work, especially for medium-sized business. We do find that with very large customers, cloud native is an approach that makes a lot of sense. And for very small customers, or should I say, small in terms of complexity, IT complexity, that's where cloud native becomes quite beneficial. And SaaS is obviously extremely beneficial. So SaaS, obviously, options like M365, some of those are just almost no-brainers nowadays. So when considering that, just keep that in mind. And to summarize that in terms of what I would definitely consider as one of the primary things when looking at moving to the cloud is think about that service that you try to offer rather than the server. So look at the particular workload and consider how that service is being offered currently and how best to offer that in a more cloud native approach. So this could involve using a SaaS offering. It doesn't necessarily have to be Azure, or it could be some SaaS, some PaaS, with maybe even some VMs for stuff that's a bit more legacy. So for example, rather than running a file server on-prem and migrating that as is to the cloud, consider options maybe like SharePoint Online, or possibly even Teams if they need SMB access. That could also be combined. So you could have some stuff sitting in SharePoint Online, maybe expose that through Teams, and the rest of it exposed via Azure Files. And that way you make use of your 365, if you've got 365, then you're taking advantage of that 1 terabyte plus storage that you have in SharePoint Online, the rest of it's sitting in Azure Files, and you don't have to worry about managing and maintaining a virtual machine and the operating system, no more patch Tuesdays, that sort of stuff to worry about. The other thing is, by adopting more cloud-native solutions, that transformation may require significant more business input, some buy-in from the company to be truly successful compared to just a pure IT transformation. This will generally help with reducing costs, but it also then provide that additional business benefits such as potential increased working flexibility and agility, improved user experiences, that sort of thing. That business transformation, utilizing SaaS services, for example, utilizing more cloud-native services, they do tend to change the way users may have done things in the past. So if we go back to that example of replacing a file server with, say, SharePoint Online, that's a different way of working with files than users may have been accustomed to previously, but also then provides them a more agile way of working with those files, so they can get access to them in different ways that they may not have been able to compared to, say, a VPN and a file server on-prem. So just keep that in mind, bear that in mind as options. And again, systems and solutions that are generally less complex tend to be easier to migrate into this into a new world where it's pretty much greenfields, and also extremely complex where there's a lot of budget to work with in order to be able to transform that tends to be very beneficial. In the middle, that's where you have to look at each service potentially and consider each one as is. If you have a customer who has 5, 10, 20 virtual machines on-prem currently and they're looking at the cloud, a lot of that might fall away, a lot of it might be replaced with SaaS. And then if that is the case, is it beneficial enough to have, I don't know, Active Directory, for example? Can you replace that with Azure AD and then utilize resources in Azure to replace domain controllers in a traditional sense, using Intune, for example, to manage devices rather than GPOs, that sort of thing. So consider that. It probably seems like a no-brainer, but just keeping that front of mind is generally very beneficial and also helps the next section, which is cost optimizations. So the first thing is right-sizing your resources. Ensuring that you select the best fit size and tier of resource, be it to provide that workload, to provide that experience to your users, is extremely beneficial. I've given 2 examples here in terms of virtual machines and storage, but this obviously applies to many other services. And one of the biggest benefits for virtual machine is making sure that you've got the right size virtual machine. So I give an example here of a D2 SV3 with its 2 cores and 16 gigs of RAM being half the cost of a D4 SV3, which has twice as much resources. If you have a solution which is not going to utilize the full capacity requirements of a D4 SV3, halving that resource, halving your costs is going to be obviously very beneficial. Same with storage and other services. Storage of the Azure files, 42 times cheaper to take storage that is sitting, instead of having that sitting in Azure files, if it's not needed and you can archive that off, archiving that to blob tier archive storage is going to save you a massive amount of cash. We're talking about 1 terabyte of Azure files, transaction optimized LRS being 55, 60 pounds a terabyte, and Azure blob storage being about £1.40, £1.50. It's a massive difference in cost if you can leverage that service and move those users away from storing massive amounts of data for extended periods of time when they're never going to utilize it. So selecting the right service and the right tier of that service will provide massive cost benefits. But one thing I just want to note here is for those MSPs, especially the sales-focused people, obviously if you're reducing the size of a resource, you're also clearly reducing the size of your revenue. But that optimization might be something that you offer as part of an ongoing service or a service upliftment, hopefully resulting in significantly more GP while potentially hopefully saving the customer some cash at the end of the side of that. So a win-win on both cases. Alongside that right sizing, one thing that's quite beneficial to do is to monitor those resources, remembering that you're paying for those resources as you consume them, and you don't pay for them when you don't. So utilize something like Azure Monitor, Azure Advisor to make sure that the size of the resource is adequate for your utilization, that you haven't, one, oversized it, so you need to now right size that, as we said before, or potentially where you're hitting peak utilization too frequently. So it might be that you've undersized something and you actually need to make something bigger because performance might hit, or you need to scale out, or whatever the case may be. Utilizing Azure Monitor and Azure Advisor can definitely help in those cases. Along with that, determining baselines for those resources, having an understanding of those workloads. Now that can be difficult if those workloads are not your own, and potentially this might be where some proactive service offering could be offered. But understanding the workloads to size that workload, not just for the peak requirements, but looking at when it's not being utilized as the peak times. And then going into the next point is turning off those resources when not needed, or reducing the size of those resources outside of peak times. Making sure that your costs are kept to a minimum and being dynamic with that. So again, don't be scared to be dynamic with your resource utilization, because traditionally, on-prem, my experience has always been that I would have I'd size up a virtual machine or whatever the case would be in the past. I would put it in place. It would probably be over-spec'd, but it's on a platform which we've got full control over. So over provisioning is it's fine, and we provide that out with too many resources. And obviously, if you were to do the same thing within the cloud, your cost would be significantly more. So keeping your cost to a minimum and keeping those resources to the maximum that they need to be when they need them is obviously going to be very beneficial. And obviously, a lot of this can be automated using things like Azure Functions and Azure Logic Apps. Some of that can even plug into Azure Monitor, so you could set something up to, okay, if I hit a peak or I hit a certain time or whatever the case is, I know I can reduce my utilization of this particular resource at this period of time, or I could turn that thing off, then definitely set that up. Not only will that provide you a benefit, it will also obviously provide that customer cost saving, and part of that USP that you can offer to your customers. The next thing to talk about in terms of cost optimization are reservations. So Azure Reservations will help you save money on various Azure resources by committing to a 1 or 3-year plan for specific resources in a specific area, region, for a specific SKU. So those commitments allow you to get a discount on the resource, quite a significant discount on those resources, typically up to 75% compared to pay-as-you-go pricing. After you purchase the reservation, the discount will apply automatically to a matching resource. So you don't buy a reservation for a particular VM or a particular set of storage. You're applying it to that resource group and anything, or subscription or shared scope, and it'll apply to anything within that area. So that'll apply at the end of that. So that's the benefit of that. Reservations work well when you have a consistent resource usage for a given period of time. So, for example, if you know your customer is going to be running, I don't know, a domain controller in the cloud for the next 2-3 years, whatever the case is, a 1-year, 3-year commitment on that virtual machine to help reduce the cost. It might not be significant for something like a domain controller, but anything, all of that can help. Again, also remember it's for a specific region. So if you have purchased a virtual machine reservation in UK South, as the example there, if you've got a failover situation going, and you say you're using something like Azure Site Recovery to recover services in terms of major outage into, say, UK West, that reservation stays in the UK region. It doesn't move to UK West. So that's specific for a region. Another thing that I've learned recently is if you're looking at moving a CSP subscription from one partner to the next, there's also complications with the reservations in that respect. So they need to be repurchased, I believe. There is some flexibility with reservations, so you do have the ability to reassign them. So that's where you can change the level of the assignment. So resource groups with subscription level or shared scope. The shared scope being, for example, all subscriptions for a customer's tenant within, say, a Byte CSP, which would be separate maybe from a pay-as-you-go subscription that they would have. You can also exchange reservations. We talk about reserved instances, but this does apply to all reservations. And this is where all you'll need to do for an exchange is find a reservation of a similar type that basically costs more than what the outstanding commitment is. So if you have a virtual machine that's costing, say, 100 quid a month, and that's a 1-year plan, you 6 months through, so you have 600 pounds effectively of commitment remaining. All you need to do is find another virtual machine of 601 pounds or more to be able to do an exchange for that new thing. When you do that exchange, the date of that new reservation, because it's effectively a cancel and a repurchase, will start from that new date that you bought it. It doesn't continue the original assignment date. So if you've got a bunch of virtual machines and you're buying for one, you might end up with a situation where you have reservations renewal dates out of sync with each other. So it's just something to bear in mind if you are doing exchanges. The last option is obviously to cancel, but if you if you go for a cancel, there is a potential for I think it's a 12% fee to be a cancellation fee from the outstanding commitment. This is just there to ensure that customers aren't abusing reservations, that they're intended to be an actual long-term commitment, and hence the reason for the discount. Some examples of reservations. Obviously, virtual machine reservations, obviously, reserved instances, as they're often referred to. With reserved instances, the reservation only applies to the compute aspect of the virtual machine. So a virtual machine is going to comprise of that compute aspect. There's going to be a disk associated to it, and potentially some licensing, say Windows Server or SQL Server or anything on top of that. That server licensing and that disk costs are still going to be aren't affected by that aspect of the reservation. So if you're getting a 60% discount on the compute on the reserved instance, that's only going to be on that, that B series, that D series, whatever that size of the virtual machine is. The associated disk and the licensing isn't affected, and there'll be line items for that in your bill. Managed disk reservations are possible, but only for SSDs of size P30, so the 1 terabyte premium SSDs, and they're only available on 1 year. The managed disk reservations tend to be about 5% savings, so it's not massive, but obviously, if you've got a lot of them for a customer, then everything counts. Blob storage reserved capacity is available in 100 terabyte and 1 petabyte per month units. So if a customer has 103 terabytes, you're going to be able to purchase a reservation for 100 terabytes, but you still have to pay as you go on that 3 extra terabytes. That's also done at the subscription level or the scope level. It doesn't allow you to do it on a resource group level. We do find that if you are offering options of, say, backup services, for example, from on-prem to cloud, so maybe the customer's staying on-prem, but they want a backup solution in the cloud, maybe using something like Veeam or Rubrik, one of those options, which works quite well with the solution, then 100 terabytes can be met quite quickly, because you'll find that those backup chains can take up quite a bit of data. One thing to consider with blob storage is when you do purchase a reservation, you are purchasing not just for the region and the type, but you also need to factor in the redundancy option and the tier of the storage. So if you are looking at, say, blob, it could be that you're buying it for blob LRS cool tier, for example. So that would be perfect for something like a solution where a customer is doing backup to the cloud and they only need it in one Azure region. Or they could be looking at GRS, so it's replicated to, say, from UK South to UK West. One thing I actually recently learned with blob storage reservations is that you can't actually purchase blob storage reservations in UK West. Again, another tip potentially. Always utilize UK South if you are looking at deploying within the UK as your primary region, and you look at UK West as that secondary site. If you do something like a backup service to UK South and you decide to go something like cold, globally redundant storage, then you still can buy that reservation, but you couldn't do it the opposite way. You couldn't do it to UK West and GRS to UK South. That's actually surprisingly not available. Not sure why. SQL databases, so this is for reserving vCores on both managed instance and SQL database, so both elastic pool and single databases. Obviously, it's the vCore model, not DTUs. So if you're on the DTU model, you'll have to figure out if moving to a vCore model will meet your requirements. Obviously, there's a difference in how those resources are applied using the two different models. And with a vCore model, you will need to specify the performance tier and type, so business critical, that sort of stuff. Pretty much the same as you're going through and creating a database. Just some additional stuff to consider there. In terms of databases, if you're not looking to use Microsoft SQL Server, you can also do the vCore reserved instances for Maria, Postgres, and MySQL. So those database options, managed PaaS offerings. App Service is I think they were released in October or November last year, the premium V3 SKUs. You can now purchase those under CSP reservations, whereas App Service hasn't had a reserved instance option in the past. And the great thing about that is if you look at the premium V3, which in the background they're utilizing DV3 VMs, do provide more vCores and more RAM as compared to the premium V2 SKUs. Those SKUs would have used those DV2 VMs in the background. And with the reservations, you can actually get more performance and a better cost than a similar premium SKU. So definitely something to look at. So if you do have customers that are using App Service at the moment, the premium V2, then consider looking at premium V3 and consider looking at what the impact may be of moving from V2 to V3, because there is a difference in how those underlying VMs provide resources, the Azure Compute Units. One last thing for actual cost optimizations, and this may or may not apply to your customers, but if your customers have Windows Server licenses, so Windows Server and Windows SQL Server licenses with active software assurance, they can make use of the Azure Hybrid Use benefit in the cloud. So that is where, for example, with Windows Server licenses, you don't pay for the Windows Server licensing aspect within in Azure. So you can bring those licenses across for you. There is differences in how those licenses work between the data center editions and the standard editions. And obviously also with the SQL Server, there's some licensing requirements there. And if you know SQL Server, it's a minimum of 4 cores. So your VMs will have to be quite large. And with SQL Server, that applies to both VMs and anything under the vCore model, so managed instances or SQL servers. Okay, so some tips for the Azure Pricing Calculator. These are just things that I find beneficial when I use it, and I use it almost on a daily basis, probably multiple times a day. I recommend signing in for the best experience. That does allow you to then export and save your estimates, which means that you can work with those and keep them as you work with them. This share option is something that I find also very beneficial when working both internally with my colleagues and working with partners. You might be working on something, and rather than exporting and sending an Excel document with that export, it's a lot easier just to share and use the share command, which brings up a HTTP link, which allows me to open that up, or you to open that up in the Azure Pricing Calculator and continue working and see exactly what has been set up. Sometimes you look at the export, and it takes quite a bit of time to be able to then go through it and think, okay, well, this is missing, or maybe they should have added this. If you've got something and you're working with something and you share that with your colleague with a link, they can then go in, add a few items, or change things, modify things as necessary, and then send that back, and you can go backwards and forwards with that. It's not the most ideal way of sharing things, but it's definitely a lot better, I think, than working with a Excel document. And if you're going to be sharing, then I would also highly recommend labeling things, so you can actually just go in, start off saying your estimate. You can change that to something more appropriate, like my example here on the left-hand side, saying application server. So you can put that in context of the solution, or you can have a customer's name. Obviously, you can save multiple copies of this. And then you can add your resources, and you can also title those, label those, providing more descriptive names. So for example, I've labeled that virtual machine rather than just saying virtual machine. I've titled that app server, so it appends that text app server to the next to the chevron there. You can see the size there. And in this particular case, for example, if you add a virtual machine and you need an operating system disk of 128 gigs, so a P10, but maybe you need an additional data disk. In this case, I've got a P4 added. You can't add that within the virtual machine context, within that part of the estimate. Just a tip there is to add a storage account, add a managed disk, and assign that appropriately, and label that appropriately. What you can do is, if you decide to do it later, you can actually now reorder the order of how things appear in the pricing calculator. So that's a little icon that appears to the right. So that's just something I've thought of now. So then you can bring it up and make sure that they're close to each other to make sense of that when you're looking at it later, especially. Okay. So onto the frameworks. Microsoft offers two main frameworks that I would highly recommend that you have a look at. It's a lot of text, definitely something to consider taking your time on if you do decide to read through it. You won't need to read through all of it, but a lot of it is relevant, especially with the Cloud Adoption Framework. So the Cloud Adoption Framework provides that guidance to implement solutions within the cloud. It takes into consideration a number of those things I've mentioned in the past about getting the business involved. So within that defined strategy and the planning and the ready stage, getting the right people within the business, it identifies who those people are, what those job titles might be, and how they would get involved. It also provides some guidance around things like naming conventions, tagging. Definitely always tag everything, especially under the ready zone when you start implementing that stuff. But the defined strategy and the plan becomes quite useful, especially if you're taking that approach of more of a business transformation in terms of that cloud movement migration, rather than just a simple lift and shift IT transformation. What we do find is a lot of our customers then, our partners get very involved with the ready, adopt, and govern, manage stages. And that govern, manage stage is where you'll probably have the ongoing cyclical type of service where you're looking at what you've done, updating, modifying, changing things, having that life cycle management of workloads that get adopted and implemented into Azure. The well-architected framework is just, it's quite new, and that's these 5 tenets of improving the quality of a workload, as Microsoft puts it. So it goes into cost optimization, so a lot of what we've spoken about today. It goes into reliability, so how things behave when things go wrong. Last year, if I remember correctly, one of the data centers in the UK South region went down. If you weren't using availability zones, or you didn't have a service which could fail over into UK West or whatever the case may be, customers found that they lost access to resources because they hadn't designed for reliability of that nature. So making sure that you design for that. This architecture, this framework allows you to go through that and identify those things. Things such as security and the performance efficiency, definitely very important. And then obviously operations excellence, as mentioned within the cloud adoption framework, is keeping those things running, keeping an eye on systems, making sure that you're using the best service, for that solution. I just wanted to also mention a few features and tools that, especially within the indirect market, will be beneficial. The first, and this is probably something you've heard me talk about before if you've been on some of my previous calls, is Azure Lighthouse. This is a free service Microsoft offers to companies and to customers who utilize or support multiple subscriptions or multiple tenants. And you want to be able to provide support through effectively a single pane of glass. So basically it would allow you, if you're, for example, the example of an MSP, instead of you having usernames and passwords on each of your customers' platforms, instead what you do is through Lighthouse, you get access to their tenants and you provide access to your users. So your users will log into your portal, into your Azure tenant. They will then have access to the resources within the customers that they've been granted access to. So for example, within one customer, you might have a bunch of users who are first-line support, but maybe in another customer's environment, they provide second-line support. So they could be delegated different access across different customers. And this becomes quite useful where you start managing multiple customers. If you've got 10, 20, 30 customers running Azure resources, being able to provide that access in a single pane of glass effectively to your admin users, to the people who are supporting those systems, becomes very beneficial because they can perform certain tasks across all of your customers rather than having to go individually to each customer, which could potentially provide, expose additional security concerns. Whereas this does it through your environment, and you know who has done what within your customer's environment. So quite beneficial, Azure Lighthouse. Just some resources to consider. Again, I just mentioned availability zones, and at the most recent Ignite, it has been announced that all foundational and mainstream services will have Azure availability zone support by the end of 2021. Which is great. All new regions will have availability zones, and all current regions will have availability zones. That doesn't really apply much to us in the UK if you're looking to apply resources within the UK or Europe, because UK South, for example, has an availability zone, and the European data centers also have availability zones. But make sure you actually utilize them. They're no good unless you actually consider using them when you create your resources. Azure Bastion, we are seeing a number of customers who aren't using this where it could be beneficial. Azure Bastion is very much like a jump box solution, but integrated into the Azure portal. This means that when you try to access, say, a virtual machine, for example, You don't need to expose that virtual machine to the outside world. You don't need to VPN into the tenant to be able to access that VM. You go into the portal, and this works with Lighthouse as well. You go into the portal, you create a connection. You don't need any additional tools. You now able to log into that VM from within the portal and be able to access that VM, be able to do the support required on top of that. So that's definitely something to consider. And then logic apps, as I mentioned earlier, being able to automate tools, workflows and that sort of stuff, be it within Azure Monitor, be it separately. Very easy to use, I find at least. You build up the workflow visually, and it's a low-code, no-code solution. In fact, we've been speaking to one particular bank, for example, where they're actually replacing some legacy software with logic apps rather than Azure Functions or anything else, because they want to go for this no-code solution, being able to manage as little code as possible. And obviously, by having no code, it's actually quite a low barrier to entry to utilizing this sort of technology. Something that would have been maybe a little bit more difficult on-prem, where you'd have to do like scripting and that sort of stuff to be able to do that. So some new resources available in Azure. So Windows Admin Center, if you're familiar with Windows Admin Center for on-prem, this is now baked into the portal in preview. It's a little bit different to the on-prem option. It provides you access to resources that sit within a VM, a Windows VM, directly within the portal. So you can, upload some certificates. You can create users. You can modify shares, the firewall. You can do roles, and you can even run some basic PowerShell scripting within that. So it exposes that VM's capabilities into the cloud portal itself without you having to manage that separately. My suspicion is, while the service is probably going to be offered as free once it gets released, I suspect they will eventually release a Windows Admin Center like premium edition or something of that nature. This hasn't been announced, it's just purely my speculation, whereby they will probably offer all the additional functions of Windows Admin Center that you'd find on-prem, such as being able to do, say, domain services and those, managing more than just the virtual machine itself. If you do go for the preview, just Google that. There is a link to be able to find that, and then you just apply to join that preview if you haven't used it already. Another thing that's also very useful, I think, is going to be Azure Auto Manage. Now that is also in preview, so you can use it, but again, as with other things in preview, we wouldn't usually recommend using them in production. So start playing with it now so that you understand what it's like when it does come out. But Auto Manage, basically, this automates certain processes that you would do on a regular basis within a virtual machine, be it Windows or Linux. Things like, updating patches, making sure it complies to certain, say, DSCs and that sort of stuff. This can automate those sort of tasks, and you can set basically a template that or utilize one of the pre-existing templates that a virtual machine has to adhere to in order to be, to support that. And if it needs to remediate stuff, it'll automatically remediate that on your behalf. So a really great way of, if you have to manage virtual machines, then this is something to ease some of that admin burden from you. One last thing is to utilize Azure Policies. So policies, if you're not familiar with them, they enforce standards across your environment. I've given some examples there. One of the most beneficial ones that I find is to make sure that you enforce tags, or specific tags, for example, such as when you create a new resource, make sure that a tag for department, a tag for project, cost codes, that sort of thing, those sort of tags which are beneficial to the business are applied to those resources when they get created, so that you have a better understanding of what is running in the environment. Those tags can then be exposed through things like our quantum toolset that you'll have access to. And then obviously learning resources, virtual training days, the UK site, I double checked that yesterday, and whilst sometimes they might not, the options might not be available, there is some availability for the Azure Fundamentals training course that they have available, I think in May. The great thing about doing that course is if you do it, you get a free exam voucher to do the AZ 900. There's also some other ones. So there's Power Platform, and I think there's an MS one as well. So definitely worthwhile to have a look at those training days, some free training, and then potentially some free, exam vouchers. And lastly, obviously, Microsoft Learn. Definitely a go-to resource to learn new things within Azure and everything Microsoft, really. Highly recommend it. It's presented in a really great way. A lot of the stuff for the Azure stuff, as an example, as you're going through it, you'll get things that you need to do. So it will actually allow you to create a sandbox. I think it exists for about 4 hours, and you can go in and actually get to play with those Azure resources that are part of that training for free, without having to have any cost or anything associated to that. You can get yourself or whoever else in your business accustomed to utilizing the portal, accustomed to utilizing those resources, and following a set of training, which is, I find, pretty beneficial. So next up is the Azure incentive I mentioned earlier, which my colleague Imran will discuss with you. Imran?
Hi, Brandon. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Oh, fantastic. Yes. If you can get to the next screen, please, that would be greatly appreciated. So I just want to quickly go over the new incentive that was released on the 1st of March, and this is basically designed to help partners actually grow the Azure consumed revenue on certain customers. So what this means is that any of your customers that had an Azure subscription set up from July last year to February this year that were under the threshold of $1,000 per month, if you are able to get them over to $1,500, Microsoft will pay you a one-off payment of $1,000. So in order to be eligible for this, we just need to basically obtain your delegated admin email address for the partner, or for you, the partner, sorry, and your MPN location ID. Submit that over to us. We'll basically get you placed on the eligible partner list and help you drive that consumption with your customers as well. So reach out to your account manager on this as well. They'll have a list of all the partners that would be eligible and your customers if transacting through us, and then we're happy to identify them with yourselves and help you get them across that threshold as well. They only have to go up to $1,500 once during this quarter, and then the payments will be paid into your incentives through Partner Center, as your rebates are paid directly to you as well. So please do reach out to us and your account manager and let us know if you'd like to see if you're eligible for the incentive, and the last day for this would be 15th of May. But we're happy to share this information across to you after the call if you have any queries, or reach out to myself directly as well. Thanks, Brandon.
Cool. Great. So thank you all for joining us today. If there are any questions, Cassie, did any questions come through?
Yeah, I'm just checking now. No, I don't think there are any questions. If anyone does have one, you can obviously pop them in the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Alternatively, if you think of anything post-webinar, you can email tellmemore@bytes.co.uk, or of course reach out to your Bytes account manager, and we will do our best to answer those for you. But for now, it doesn't look like we have any, which is a good sign. Means, Brandon, you've covered everything that anyone was considering that they may have questioned over. We will send out a copy of the recording either later today or tomorrow, so keep a look out for that in your inbox. But for now, that's all from me. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Imran, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye all.
Thank you.